Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which is going to look at the politics of voting during a pandemic. This is actually our second virtual event we've held this semester. Our first one we held last week. It examined the ethics of allocating scarce healthcare resources during the pandemic. And if you missed that, you'd like to watch it, you can still see it on our YouTube archive, or you can go to the Foley Institute website, look at our previous events and find a link to it there. Those of you who are watching today via YouTube, I want to encourage you to send in your questions to us. You can send those to me via email at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's tsfoley as in Thomas S. Foley at wsu.edu. Anyone watching last week's election in Wisconsin witnessed both the technical difficulties and the political challenges of voting during a pandemic. Large numbers of polling stations across the state of Wisconsin were closed because poll workers, many of whom are vulnerable senior citizens, stayed home. Voters were forced to stand in long lines and risk catching contagious, deadly diseases in order to participate in American democracy. The state's Democratic governor tried to postpone the election. He offered a plan for expanding mail-in balloting, but Republicans in the legislature fought that effort, and the state Supreme Court blocked the governor's plan. Indeed, the two major parties are now in a sharp disagreement over how to plan for November's presidential election. They are especially at odds over whether we should expand access to mail-in balloting. Currently, 5 states, including Washington, have vote-by-mail systems. 33 other states allow no excuse absentee mail-in ballots, but voters must request those ballots. 13 states currently impose more onerous restrictions on anything other than in-person voting. In Congress, Democrats have proposed legislation to require all states to offer mail-in ballots. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has made this a top priority in future Democratic efforts to address the economic effects of the pandemic. But many Republicans oppose these efforts. Some worry about the technical and legal difficulties of instituting reforms in time. Others worry about ballot security. Still others worry that expanding mail-in voting might disadvantage Republican candidates at the polls. President Trump recently said Republicans should fight efforts to expand vote by mail because of potential voter fraud, but also because, quote, it doesn't work out well for Republicans, end quote. So what should we do to prepare for the next election? What are the technical and legal issues involved in moving to a process where all Americans can vote by mail? What are the real concerns about ballot security? And what do studies tell us about the partisan or other effects of mail-in voting? So fortunately, we have with us today a terrific panel of experts who can answer most or all of these questions. Our first guest today will be Dr. Paul Gronke, who will provide an overview of how elections are run in the United States and what we know about mail-in voting versus other ways of running elections. Paul is a professor of political science and the director of the Early Voter Information Center at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. His center provides nonpartisan, empirically sound solutions to the problems in election administration. Dr. Gronke studies American politics, specializing in voting, election administration, and public opinion. He previously served as editor of Election Law Journal and is currently the co-editor of Political Science and Politics. Following Dr. Gronke will be Professor Todd Donovan, who will examine the political questions involved in election reform. Todd is a professor of political science at Western Washington University with visiting appointments in Australia and New Zealand. His research examines the intersection of political behavior, representation, and electoral institutions. He is the author, co-author, or co-editor of dozens of books and numerous research articles, and he has served as an advisor to media outlets and to state and federal courts on matters involving voting and elections. After Professor Donovan, our final panelist will be Howard Schweber, who will discuss some of the legal and constitutional issues involved in changing how we run our elections. Howard is a professor of political science and an affiliate faculty member of the law school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. His research focuses on constitutional law, comparative constitutionalism, and democratic theory. Professor Schweber is the author of 4 books and numerous research articles. He closely followed and was a media commentator about the recent election in Wisconsin. Following this, there will be some time for discussion. And again, I urge you, if you have some questions, to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. So gentlemen, I will now turn the time over to you, and I'll be back later with some questions from our viewing audience.
Thanks. I think I'm up first, Cornell, and I appreciate that. I also want to thank you and the Foley Center for organizing this event. I want to let any viewers know there are a number of academic organizations that are trying to participate along with Foley to help inform the public, election administrators and policymakers about what kind of choices are in front of us. So I want to let some of the listeners know they can follow me on Twitter at Gronke. If you navigate through the pictures of gardening and kayaking, which Todd has seen some of those, we do need to get outside a little bit. I hope everyone's safe and healthy, of course. But I post fairly regularly information on election reform and administration. I also recently participated in a very similar event at the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. That's shorthand MEDSL, but if you search for MIT elections, you'll find that on Twitter. And the Vote at Home Institute, the National Vote at Home Institute, of which I'm on their circle of advisors, is also putting out very good information about some of the choices that need to be made. So again, thanks for the invitation. I also want to thank Cornell for undermining most of my 10 minutes by citing the data and statistics that I was going to cite. So thanks for making me adjust on the fly. There's nothing like that, but we've all been there. So I'm going to summarize a little bit, give the 30,000-foot view of some of the election system in the US, some of which Cornell already described. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes detailing some of the sort of less well-known features of what it would mean to institute widespread no excuse absentee balloting or a full vote by mail system, particularly in states that don't have prior experience. And some of that is pertinent to the debates that are occurring over the Wyden Klobuchar bill that are also occurring in response to President Trump's tweet. So let me start with this overview. Clayton already described some of that. Now, we all agreed as a panelist that we would not have PowerPoint slides. We did not agree, however, that we would not use different backgrounds. So look at that. I snuck in a slide. And I could be a weatherman or weather person and point to. So this, what I do want to say here is this comes from the National Conference of State Legislatures, ncsl.org. They're a site that many in the academic advocacy community use, and of course state legislatures who they serve, to try to track the legal environment and legal regime in the many states around the country, in DC and in the territories. So this graphic is straight off of their page, the NCL early voting and absentee page, and it lays out some of the variation in the ways different states do things. If that's visible at home, what they've done is they've color-coded states that have some sort of early in-person voting system. That means you show up, you cast a ballot on an election machine, you interact with an election official, very much like you do if you vote on election day, typically at far fewer locations. Sometimes this is called satellite voting, sometimes called voting centers. Then there are states that have voting by mail or no excuse absentee balloting. Quite a number of states have that. Clayton already described that. 34 states plus DC have no excuse absentee balloting. And then there are the 5 states that Cornell mentioned, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Hawaii, and Utah, that have full vote by mail. That's the term I will use. They have full vote by mail. Also, what is sometimes called universal ballot delivery. That is, every registered voter who is active and eligible receives a ballot through the mail. This is a very important distinction to understand because no excuse absentee balloting, that is, you apply for an absentee ballot, but you are not required to provide an excuse. That is different than a full vote by mail system. Under a no excuse system, you receive an absentee ballot through the mail if you request it. Under the full vote by mail system, everyone receives a ballot. A ballot is delivered to everyone, and those who choose to return it by some means, whether that means be by mail, whether that means be through the US Postal Service. So I make that distinction, particularly that final distinction, because I think that distinction is one of the a difference that has animated, or a lack of clarity about some language that has animated some debates, and in fact taken us off on sidetracks. I think where I think there may be more opportunities for consensus and agreement, even in Washington D.C. I know how difficult that is these days, but my sense from hearing people debate and following some of these active discussions on listservs and email is that some sort of federal mandate for no excuse absentee balloting, which is part of the Wyden Klobuchar bill, may be something that could actually pass Congress and be signed by the president. I don't think that's what President Trump meant when he tweeted about mail elections. I think what President Trump meant was a universal ballot delivery system, what we will call an all vote by mail system, or I will during today's discussion. That is a really critical distinction. It may be that we are going to be moving to full vote by mail in more states. It may be, there are people that are advocating for that kind of system. That is really very, very different from no excuse absentee balloting. So let me close in the last couple of minutes by saying why that's so different. Because under a full vote by mail system, you have to be ready to generate, you have to find a vendor who can produce paper ballots that conform to certain specifications, produce those ballots, and then deliver those ballots to every single registered voter on your rolls. Your rolls need to be very clean. You don't want any deadwood on your rolls. Now, listeners may think, well, aren't registration rolls always clean? Well, no. Some states choose to allow individuals to stay on the rolls, even when that individual may have moved out of state or has not updated their voter record in a period of time. The reason is that sometimes people move, they don't participate in every election, and you want to give people an opportunity to reactivate their record. In other states like Oregon and Washington that use the Postal Service, we have extremely clean rolls because we know almost immediately when we send a mailing to them when someone has moved. And so we can generate a postcard and ask them to update their record. So under a mature, active, operating vote by mail system, you have very clean rolls. And so we're confident that the ballots that we send out go to individuals who are registered and we have their current address. Under the regime in many other states, we have no assurance of that. We have no assurance that those rolls are as clean as they can be. And so it's possible, and one well-known commentator, Rick Hazen, who is a lawyer, an election lawyer, one of our nation's leading election lawyers at University of California, Irvine, he's expressed some concern about going to full vote by mail for that very reason, that there will be too many ballots out there in states that have not gone through the process of making absolutely certain that the rolls are as clean as possible. And the other vulnerability in a vote by mail system is simply the voter is casting the ballot at a time and place of their own choosing, vote at home as some call it, and there's no feedback from a voting machine if the voter makes an error. So it's inevitable under ballots, whether it be no excuse or vote at home, that the voter error rate will be higher. And that's simply inevitable. I view that as a cost of this system. There are benefits, there are administrative benefits and budgetary benefits, but there is a cost on the voter side that if voters are not careful, if they don't pay close attention, if the ballot are not designed as well as they could be, that there may be a higher level of signature rejection rates, there may be a higher level of error rates, and there is evidence from some states that certain communities, African Americans, Native Americans, other vulnerable communities, have a higher rate of ballot rejection. And that's something that we would want to make sure is absolutely minimized if we go to some sort of system where we have more widespread voting by mail. So that's where I'm going to close for now. I've got a few other backgrounds, but I don't think anyone wants to see those. So I'll go back to Reed College, and I'm going to hand this off to my friend and colleague in a campus almost as beautiful as Reed, Western Washington up in Bellingham.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm not on campus. I'm at home in a closet, pretty much. Last time I saw Paul Gronke actually was at the Iowa caucuses, these most recent caucuses we were observing there. And it's kind of maybe a lesson in the difficulty of changing rules on the fly. I think Paul would confirm, we were observing a couple of different precincts, and they had to change the way they're going to be counting and casting ballots and reporting everything. And it was a disaster. It's maybe a polite way to put it. So I just wanted to just throw it out there when we think about the administrative challenges of going to some kind of vote by mail system nationally. Paul touched on that sort of stuff, but I was asked to talk about the politics of this sort of an election reform. And, Paul mentioned the prospects of maybe something passing through Congress. I might conclude with something a little less optimistic than he did. Actually, and Cornell had charged me with trying to get at the question of whether there's a partisan advantage in vote-by-mail systems. So I'll make sure I cover that too. But at least, you know, if we think the politics of this in terms of like public opinion and where Democrats and Republicans are in state legislatures, maybe even in Congress, there's huge divisions and polarization over any attempts to make it easier to vote and oversimplify Republicans resistant to reforms that might make it easier to vote, Democrats more acceptant. And part of this has to do with perceptions of fraud, and Paul touched on that a bit, how secure a ballot is. But Democrats and Republicans have different perceptions of fraud, and this predates Donald Trump's discussion about the 2016 election. Democrats have a more tendency to be suspicious of the mechanics of electronic voting because of some ideas about what happened in Ohio in the 2004 presidential election. Republicans, and I'm talking about voters really right now, Republicans are more suspicious of illegal ballots being cast, ineligible people somehow obtaining ballots and casting them. But there's pretty stark partisan differences in those. And so when we think about how this might play out, you know, with any kind of legislation getting through Congress, you know, that's where the party's voters are. And if we look at the attempts to pass voter ID laws, or even the old motor voter reforms that made it easier to register back in the 1990s, these are sometimes near perfect partisan divisions, particularly like photo ID laws. You know, like you look at legislative floor votes on this, every Republican's voting one way and almost every Democrat's voting the other way. So that's just some of the background. And you know, if we look at any of the debates recently about, if you look at Florida and the controversy over felons voting and how that was going to be implemented, if you look at state attempts at limiting polling places or ending early voting, or implementing voter rolls, how voters are purged from voter rolls when that's necessary. Again, there's, you know, consistently stark partisan divisions there. So that's the environment we're looking for some kind of I would say compromise or some sort of resolution. And I guess with that sort of background, I'm maybe a little less optimistic than Paul is that we would see some sort of bipartisan agreement. It's you know, election rules, and this goes not just with legislatures, but with the courts. It's one of the most polarizing things. If we look at, you know, the way the Wisconsin thing played out in the courts, it's very few policy areas have this much sort of division between partisans, in part because the stakes are so huge. So all that set aside, you know, that's the environment. If we actually look at the academic literature, it's much less clear that there are partisan advantages to some of these, or to many of these laws. In terms of, and I'm just using the phrase vote by mail broadly here, not as precise as Paul was. But you know, some of the more influential studies of rolling out vote by mail in Oregon, which switched to all vote by mail, Paul would have to, I don't know the year of that, concluded that it does increase turnout, but it really isn't necessarily changing the composition of the electorate. It's getting the regular voters voting more regularly. It's not getting you know, the voters that might be expected if turnout goes up to give an advantage to the Democratic Party, because they'd be, you know, younger voters perhaps. That we don't see any clear evidence of that, at least in some of those studies of Oregon. That doesn't mean that partisans in legislatures don't think that. My colleague Sean Bowler and myself did a book a few years ago called The Limits of Electoral Reform, where we're looking at, you know, what reformers promise or expect in terms of the outcomes that we might see with adopting term limits, or adopting proportional representation or direct democracy, and, you know, arguments about these that they might have in terms of increasing turnout or partisan effects. And there's not, when you actually look at stuff over time, there's not really clear effects there. I think So I'll conclude and then maybe take some questions about this later, but that there is this mindset, there are these partisan divisions, that the stakes of these things, and I'm just talking about technical administrative things like, how voter purges are done, how voter rolls are maintained, that the perception is that these have huge partisan effects. And I think when we actually look at the literature on this, those maybe aren't as pronounced as the partisans believe they are. But having said that, partisans believe that there's a lot at stake here. And what Trump is tweeting about, how vote by mail might hurt Republicans, that's tapping into this sort of public opinion about the stakes of these things, really determining that these reforms will determine who wins elections. And I don't know how we get past that right now. So with that, I'll pass it off to Howard.
Hey, Howard, you got to turn on your mic.
Got it. Sorry about that. I'm also told I should apologize to the entire audience for this shirt. I wasn't aware it would produce this shimmer effect, which I gather can induce seizures. I videotaped a lecture earlier this afternoon with a different technology and didn't have this effect, so I wasn't expecting this, and I do apologize. I've been asked to talk about the law and legal and constitutional issues here, which is a little bit of a shame because I have lots of opinions about the political issues and did watch the Wisconsin election up close and personal living here in Wisconsin. But perhaps during the Q&A, I'll be able to come back to some of those questions. So Professor Donovan is a little bit less optimistic than Professor Gronke. I'm going to be very unoptimistic. I'm going to predict that what we saw in Wisconsin will not be the only case of its kind, and we will see lots of efforts, not everywhere to be sure. A number of Republican governors have already demonstrated they're open to voting by mail. This isn't a simplistic issue. And I should add, parties trying to encourage or discourage voting on the theory that it will benefit them goes back to at least the 1830s. So this is not a novel calculation. But I'm going to predict there's going to be more elections that look like the Wisconsin one that raise the kind of issues that were raised in that context. And those are what I want to focus on. And I want to start with a proposition that may shock some of our listeners and viewers. It certainly shocks my students whenever I tell them this for the first time. And that is the proposition that the United States Constitution simply does not guarantee a right to vote. It doesn't guarantee a right to effective voting or fair voting or equal voting. The only direct constitutional guarantee about voting is the 15th Amendment that says it is unconstitutional for states to restrict voting on the basis of race. Constitutionally, at least as far as the bare text goes, states are perfectly free to restrict voting on any other basis that they like, which is one reason every time there's an argument about gerrymandering or voter ID or any other voting practice, whoever is challenging the practice always couches their argument in terms of race. It's the only argument courts will hear as a constitutional matter, but has a strange kind of funneling effect on the discourse. Just this past year, we had a case called Gill versus Whitford, in which a very broad-based and serious effort was made to get the US Supreme Court to consider the possibility that gerrymandering, when it's sufficiently extreme, might be unconstitutional, might interfere with First Amendment rights or general equal protection principles or other theories of that kind. And that attempt lost, not because the court said all of the gerrymandering activities in which parties engage are necessarily constitutional, but because they said it's impossible for courts to determine that they're not. It's just not the kind of business courts are in. So look at the Wisconsin case again. In Milwaukee, because of the coronavirus and because of loss of staff, instead of 180 polling places, there were 5. And it was under those circumstances that the legislature said, you have to go ahead with in-person voting. We're not going to approve any delays, which raises sort of obvious thought experiments. What if there had been 0? What if there had been a hurricane and there had been no open polling places in Milwaukee or anywhere in 10 miles radius of Milwaukee? And of course, the politicians in Wisconsin are keenly aware that Wisconsin is a heavily minority urban area whose voters are expected to predominantly vote for Democratic candidates. That is, this was a partisan calculation that was undertaken to try and achieve an electoral advantage. And the short answer, again, is that there's no real direct remedy to that in the Constitution. There is, however, one exception to that principle, and that's a case many of us have probably heard of called Bush versus Gore. It got a lot of attention at the time. And Bush versus Gore does include a declaration by the Supreme Court that how you count ballots, at least, needs to be sufficiently consistent across the state so as not to violate concepts of equal protection. And I can easily imagine a federal court, let's say, looking at a situation like the one in Milwaukee, in which there were only 5 polling places rather than 180 polling places, in which the turnout, the in-person voting turnout in Milwaukee went from 288,000 in an early election in February down to 19,000 in this most recent election. Looking at that situation, or even a more extreme situation, I can imagine a federal court saying, this violates principles of equal protection. I'm 100% sure someone's going to bring a challenge like that. And we're going to hear this argument. There also is another sort of avenue that I'm sure will be raised in courts, which goes like this. There's poll taxes are of course illegal, but more generally, state and local governments are not permitted to charge fees for engaging in political activities if the result would be that participation is impossible for those who are truly indigent. Well, that idea that you can burden voting, but you can't make it impossible, could easily come into play in a pandemic situation. Let us assume, for purposes of discussion, that there is a second wave of coronavirus in the fall. Let us assume that there are locations, electorally important locations, in which in-person voting is taking place in the context of a hotspot, right, where the risk to life and health is substantial, as in fact, unquestionably was in Milwaukee. It is not hard to imagine a federal court being receptive to the argument that crosses the line from, rough but acceptable politics to making participation effectively impossible. So there's that. There are a couple of other potential legal theories, and I'm sure we will see them. I'm absolutely certain we will see efforts by Republican legislators to depress voting. As Professor Donovan pointed out, it's not 100% clear that actually always helps their cause, but they think that it does. And so we can expect to see those efforts occur, particularly in the context of a pandemic, which is our topic. There's just a lot more opportunity for that sort of thing. It's almost difficult to resist. And I'll point to one last technical legal issue that colors this discussion, and then close with a few comments about the broader political questions. And here's the technical legal issue. Even if we wanted to make arguments about equal protection, or the 15th Amendment, or Bush versus Gore, in a situation like Wisconsin's, we run into a legal wall that just blocks almost anything. And that's the distinction between action and inaction. It's almost impossible to argue that a state has violated the Constitution or someone's rights by failing to do something. And don't forget, the Wisconsin legislature didn't have to do anything. All they had to do was decline to change the date of the scheduled in-person election. If there's a state, again, let's take account of the fundamental divide in American politics. We don't have red states and blue states. We have red counties and blue counties. The fundamental divide in American politics is the urban-rural divide. Urban area voters tend to vote more Democratic. Rural area voters tend to vote Republican. If we have a state in which the coronavirus situation is imposing particular burdens, on urban areas, it will be calculated probably accurately by Republican legislators that they would benefit from insisting that the election go ahead as scheduled with as few accommodations as possible. And there is no constitutional right to absentee ballots or early voting or any of the rest of this stuff. So when you have a pandemic situation or a background situation of chaos and emergency, of which pandemic is, after all, only one example, as I mentioned, imagine if there had been an election in Louisiana the day after Hurricane Katrina. And the Louisiana legislature had said, nope, you have to vote in person in New Orleans. It seems safe to assume there would have been very little in-person voting in New Orleans in that situation. So what a pandemic does is it creates a situation where inaction, if carefully calibrated and carefully calculated, can become a devastatingly effective exercise of voter suppression. And that, I think, is the danger that we would face in November and the legal remedies available to challenge that are few. I did mention a couple, and they're real, but there are few. And I would certainly have very little confidence in this Supreme Court to be willing to take steps to protect access to the ballot. There's a more or less cynical way of describing this conclusion, but let me just say, based on this court's record on First Amendment issues, election finance issues, gerrymandering issues, and what are generally called law of democracy issues across the board, I have low confidence that the Roberts Court would be eager to develop new rules, new constitutional requirements of affirmative steps by states to make voting practicable as well as formally legally permissible. That was short, I know, but I think I'm happy to leave it there and hope that I've provoked some questions among our viewers and listeners.
All right, great. Hey, thanks everyone. So we have a few questions coming in. Let me start with one for Paul. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the Klobuchar-Wyden bill, what it actually entails, and whether you think it's feasible reforms.
Oh, I happen to have that printed out right here, Professor Clayton. Sure, the Wyden Klobuchar bill, the title of the bill, by the way, is, oh, I do not have that. You gotta help me. Oh, Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act. That's what Ron Wyden, who is the senior senator from Oregon, Amy Klobuchar, of course, from Minnesota. You know, Ron Wyden has been pushing a variety of election reforms, both on the technology side and on the voter access side for a number of years. So in some respects, Ron had some of the aspects of this bill already in place. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, everyone in the room here or on the call is a political scientist or says they're one with their departmental affiliations. Howard. I think you're actually a political scientist, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Officially.
I thought you're a lawyer.
I used to be that. I'm recovering slowly.
So the policy making under situations of crisis is common. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not that individuals are taking advantage of the crisis, rather that the crisis exposes some flaws or faults in our system. And this is often an opportunity for political actors to say, you know, I've got an answer for that. So Wyden and Klobuchar got together. I think the bill does a lot of things. It was sort of kicked out of the reconciliation, I believe, in the reconciliation process for the first wave of the Recovery Act that was just passed a couple weeks ago. It does mandate no excuse absentee balloting, I believe, for federal elections. It has some, I think, fairly reasonable provisions here about, I think it's going to, I'd have to look at the actual details of the bill. I believe it's going to put money on the table, federal money, to try to recruit high school and college students act as poll workers. That's both something that the elections community has needed for many years, to try to drive down a little bit the average age of the primarily volunteer group that serves as poll workers. But also there's a health risk here that younger people, of course, if exposed, you know, we've seen these from the numbers already in hospital admittance, that young people are just as are vulnerable to COVID as our older people, but the health risk in some respects are lower. And so I think simply looking for a larger population of poll workers is a good idea. There's some small things in here that may have big effects, but there's some potential budgetary implications. Prepaid postage for all citizens who apply for voter registration on the envelopes. You know, someone's going to have to pay for that. We've got a U.S. Postal Service, which is facing a financial crisis right now and would be relied on in this kind of model. The Postal Service is an absolutely critical partner. So how will that work? They're also trying to move nationally to what in the state of art, the term of art we call postmark system. That is, as in Washington, your ballot simply needs to be postmarked by election day, not actually delivered to the election office by 8 p.m. on election night. Oregon has worked with a election day requirement, and there will be a question about whether that is federal overreach. This is a constant tension between the states and the federal government about who has the time and manner clause in the Constitution about who really has control and what's the level of federal involvement in standardizing election practices. So, you know, there's a lot of pieces to the bill. The reason I say, by the way, for Howard and Todd, the reason I'm more optimistic perhaps than you two are, is it's maybe a moment that I overread, but a quite prominent lawyer on the Republican side, James Bopp, who was one of the chief lawyers in the Citizens United, did not argue the Supreme Court case, but was active and has been active in many cases. On a public listserv, said that no excuse absentee balloting he thought was an acceptable provision. And to see Mr. Bopp say that that would be something that he would not object to. Now, you know, the proof is in the pudding, right? Whether the objections are really raised. But that's one, I think, that I would hope that Congress might be able to move very judiciously under a national crisis to get this narrowly through. But I understand absolutely, Todd and Howard, the barriers to passing anything in Washington right now. Everything gets viewed in a partisan way. What I would chime in with what Todd said is, and boy, this goes back 30 or 40 years ago for the old folks in the room, but scholars were writing in the 70s and 80s about members of Congress, politicians are superstitious learners. They might have a pen or a matchbook or something that they've been handing out since they first got elected 30 years ago. And heck, stop them, got to keep sending out those matchbooks because I might lose otherwise. And Todd, I don't know if you agree, but I think that might be what's going on with some of these reforms is they know they got elected under the current system. They don't know what this other system is. As much as we show them that these systems don't have a partisan advantage, it's an unknown world, and the known world is one that they've won in.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks. So Todd, let me ask you just to follow up on that. Do you think that the fact that we're in a moment of crisis might lead to a breakthrough in some bipartisan legislation? Maybe you could discuss what you think the actual possibility of the Klobuchar-Wyden bill is to get passed. And also, I'm wondering, you know, because there is, as you mentioned, a lot of data that shows absentee ballots actually trend Republican. So why is there so much resistance on the Republican side to looking at these reforms?
I think it's a couple of things, including what Paul just touched on. I mean, when elected officials don't like the rules that they got elected and changed, but maybe more than that, though. I think a lot of our understanding about late ballots, you know, ballots that come in late, absentee ballots, trending more conservative, that might be a bit dated. The way elections are conducted now, and maybe I'm just generalizing from our state in Washington here. This way we call it vote by mail. Most people take their ballot to a drop box and physically deliver it somewhere. And there's much more of that going on in recent years. And I think that's changed the dynamic of what the late arriving ballots or absentee ballots are coming from in terms of, you know, potentially trending Republican or not. But yeah, I don't know. And I'm going to kind of go back to what Paul was saying about or the bill. As far as a bipartisan, you know, we got the Patriot Act out of 9/11. I don't think we're going to get any kind of groundbreaking legislation that's going to dramatically change how elections are done. Maybe some sort of, you know, something even as big as no excuse absentee balloting nationwide. If it was passed by Congress and signed by the president, it would be because it was seen as a very incremental change that really wouldn't do that much. I want to throw this out there and then I'll mute. But it's, you know, it's interesting. We talk about Wisconsin. The issue about Wisconsin was they didn't delay. I mean, they didn't postpone the primary. We're not having that discussion. I looked up, you know, all the elections that are scheduled in April and May and into June in various countries and states in the United States, and almost all of them are being canceled except for South Korea. That's a discussion we just don't have. Like, you know, what if it was this point in the pandemic and it's, you know, mid-October?
Oh, I wonder if I can chime in on these points just briefly, just to restore my bona fides as a political scientist, and not merely an ex-lawyer. Yeah, I certainly see signs for optimism at the state level. As I mentioned very, very quickly in passing, a number of Republican as well as Democratic governors have stepped up in a big way. To say, actually, a number of Republican governors as well as Democratic governors have stepped up in a big way in response to the coronavirus in general. They've been willing to buck the line for the president's administration, about the severity of the virus, and they've been willing to push the idea of expanding absentee balloting and voting by mail, despite that's the unpopularity of those positions with the GOP in general. There are exceptions, almost all in the South, in sort of the old Confederacy states, but there's no question at the state level there's a variety. At the national level, President Trump is sending very clear signals of what he wants. And in a question like this one, the national GOP has shown zero, I think, appetite for bucking the president. Yeah, there was some pushback on his declaration that he has total authority in a time of emergency. Frankly, no one knows. I have a theory what that's about. I have a theory that he was shown a secret memo. There are a series of secret emergency power memos that we learned about recently. And I think he was shown one and took a very shallow reading of it. But that was just a matter of verbiage. But I think that Trump is making it very clear that he will not look kindly on the idea of a national absentee ballot vote, and that's vote, a national absentee ballot system of voting, sorry. And in that situation, I don't see Mitch McConnell and the Republican caucus in the Senate being willing to go along. The last really quick comment is, it's true, we used to think of, picking up on Todd's comment, absentee ballots as tending Republican. That's partly because they were largely military and also concentrated among better educated, wealthier, and older people. The pattern has changed, as we saw in Wisconsin and elsewhere, the use of absentee ballots where it's permitted and where there are not undue burdens to getting access to such ballots has become much more widespread. And that's why I think that partisan calculation, I agree with Todd, might be just out of date.
Great, thanks. Hey, so I got another question that we can start off with Paul on, and that is, so a lot of people watching remember an incident in South Carolina, I believe it was, in the last election, where there was an operative who was doing what was called vote harvesting, going around and picking up absentee ballots and then manipulating them before he turned them in. He was prosecuted for it. How much of a problem is that, Paul? Is that something that occurs frequently? Is it something you can guard against? Or are there other problems we should be concerned about with respect to absentee ballots and vote by mail?
So that was in North Carolina. It was the 8th district in North Carolina. What happened in that situation is that you had a campaign operative, the Republican campaign operative, but a campaign operative who in North Carolina had quite lax laws regarding who can pick up and deliver absentee ballots and deliver them to the elections office. So what this operative did was engage the people that worked for him to go out and grab the ballots, and the ballots were not being delivered. And it's been a while since I reviewed the details of the case. I don't think they were filling out ballots and signing them, but I could be wrong about that. In my judgment, the reaction to that case was an overreaction. This is not a fundamental problem with no excuse absentee balloting or voting by mail. It's a problem with the election regime in North Carolina, that they were extremely generous, if not lax, in terms of the laws that they have in place for allowing what some will call ballot harvesting. This is an issue of dispute, I will say. I believe there's a case going on right now in Arizona over this exact issue, because some argue that the ability for campaigns to go and provide some level of voter assistance and help them move the ballots to the polling place is something that is that voters like and that campaigns like. I don't want to say what a best practice is here, because I'm trying to engage some election administrators and others actually to start to investigate best practices both in states and nationally over the next 6 months. It does concern me as just a citizen when ballots, they leave my hands and they're not going into the hands of a trusted provider such as the U.S. Postal Service. I would never give my ballot to a campaign. I might allow my spouse to deliver it for me, and many states do have that provision, but they really limit it. So North Carolina is not about voting by mail. It's about this ballot harvesting provision and somebody taking advantage. One last comment about North Carolina. If their data had been released on an active lifetime basis, the particular data they have, they would have been able to see this happening if they've been analyzing data in a particular way. I've been partnering with a colleague of mine down in Caltech, Michael Alvarez, to help roll out to some election officials this sort of lifetime monitoring. It doesn't mean that what the individual did in NC in North Carolina was not wrong, but in some respects, it was such a huge spike in the number of absentee ballots that were coming in from half a county. Ideally, you would have monitoring mechanisms in place that would have seen that. After the election, it was so obvious. I mean, look, let's all remember, they didn't get away with it, right? This was so obvious. And, you know, these things happen. People are still going to be trying to steal elections, whatever mechanism is out there. So, you know, it's politics is the art of war, I suppose.
Okay, great, thanks. Hey, Todd, so I have a question for you. One of our visiting scholars at WSU is from South Korea, and they just had an election there, and the ruling party won overwhelmingly, despite the fact that prior to the COVID crisis, they were behind in most of the polls. So her question is whether or not you think that a crisis like this will have the effect of making voters more conservative and preferring the status quo and continuity in government rather than voting in a challenger.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'm not familiar with the polling in South Korea, but yeah, we would expect you know, the rally effect, where in a time of crisis or war, like, you know, the 9/11 attacks, public opinion about institutions, about the incumbent president, becomes much more supportive. So it would almost lead me to expect that the president's approval ratings would be going up now because there's a crisis, or that there's just more trust. People are more likely to give government the benefit of the doubt in a time of crisis, and those factors would help the, you know, whoever the incumbent is. But we're not really seeing that. So I mean, you know, that might have been the case in South Korea, but Trump's approval ratings just never seem to budge that much. And if there is, you know, the moment of crisis sort of rally around the president that might help in an election, we're not seeing too much of that now. By November, I wouldn't expect it. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it would almost, it's sort of like it should have happened. A normal president, we might have seen, you know, a spike in approval in response to, you know, concern about a crisis, but I don't think we're seeing that.
Okay, hey, Howard, I got a question for you. So one of the criticisms of vote by mail systems in particular is that there's a number of communities like Native Americans on reservations or the homeless who don't have permanent addresses to mail ballots to. And the question is whether or not that raises equal protection questions, and is that likely to occur in these states?
Yeah, probably not. It's a weak answer, I know. It goes back to the problem with not having a sort of affirmative right to adequate voting, which is not really an equal protection argument, but because of that fact, any equal protection claim to succeed would have to demonstrate an intent to discriminate. That is, that the practice was adopted or administered with the purpose of discriminating against a minority group. And in this case, we're talking about presumably, we're hypothesizing, but we're imagining a uniform rule about voting by mail that applies equally to everybody. And in that situation, it's hard to make a claim of that kind. Any voting system is going to benefit some people and make it harder for other people to vote. That much is certainly clear. I'm not personally in favor of an exclusive vote by mail system, precisely for that reason, that those who want to, assuming there aren't public safety issues, as there may very well be, but should be able to vote in person if that's easier for them, or if they decide to do so at last minute, or whatever is the issue. But certainly expanding the number and range of options expands the opportunity to vote. It's just very hard to make that a constitutional obligation on the government. I did want to make one point about the lack of a rally effect. The response of the leader does matter. And if you think about Hoover in the Depression, he did not see a bump or a rally effect because he was widely perceived to be detached and unresponsive to the crisis. So a leader can often get a rally effect, but a leader who's perceived as being disengaged or unhelpful may find the opposite effect occurring.
Great. So Paul, I've got another question for you, and that is, in those states that, for whatever reason, do not opt to expand vote by mail, are there other ways that they can make in-person elections safer during a pandemic? And can you maybe talk about some of those?
Yeah, that's difficult. It's not exactly my wheelhouse. I do want to give a nod to Howard. I absolutely agree with his assessment, and I didn't mean to misstate what he had said, that there is movement at the state level. It's a danger in doing these webinars when we're not sitting in an office. I can try to browse the web and pretend like my eye movement is not. I did try to look up, and Howard may know this. There are a number of states who have already announced that they're going to be mailing absentee ballot applications to every single registered voter, and that is a change, and that doesn't require any federal action. It doesn't require. They are going to have to put the technology in place to manage that. And as we saw in Wisconsin, the big challenge, one of the challenges in Wisconsin, was that they had absentee ballot rates that were an order of magnitude. We sometimes use that phrase, but that really works. It was 10 times as large. It was an order of magnitude higher than they had done last time. The other technology, sure. So all this goes down to, how do you manage the voting location in which voters and poll workers have to come, and try to provide some sort of protection. I'm going to talk a little bit about just what I've seen in, again, discussions by people who really are more expert than me. But one thing I'd like to share with anyone who is in one of the states that has a stay-at-home order, and you're allowed to go out to locations to do some essential activities such as shopping. So I don't know what your local store looks like. I've been to one, and the little plexiglass screen they put up was pretty lame looking. I mean, it looked like the half size of the spit shield at, the local salad bar. I know, and again, we don't want to make it all about Wisconsin. There was a very nice discussion of the state director of elections that the MIT Election Science Lab just released 2 days ago. Barry Burden, one of Howard's colleagues at Wisconsin, and the director of elections in Wisconsin discussed some of the challenges. And part of it was simply pushing out to all the locations sufficient protective equipment for the poll workers, as well as any of the professional staff. So you're going to have spacing. And the spacing was a problem we saw immediately in some of the urban locations in Wisconsin, where the lines were extremely long because people were supposed to stand apart. Then when you enter into the polling place, you have to have some way to provide your identification if it's required. Some places still do have people signing poll books, though everything has to be sanitized. There needs to be a poll worker right there looking at you. Presumably you're 6 feet away. I don't know how you sign something from 6 feet away. How do we do that? Here's my credit card. I'm putting it in the machine, but you can't do that, right? There's not a credit card reader that we can say, I'd like to put my own credit card in the machine, please. And there was just a suit filed this morning in North Carolina saying that electronic voting machines are a risk because they need to be sanitized. So, part of me says this is feasible, but boy, I don't have to deal with 10,000 different election officials and hundreds of thousands of precinct places. I mean, that is literally what we're talking about in this country, folks. Hundreds of thousands of polling places. In California, they might be in a garage. In northern Wisconsin, they might be a township with 200 voters. LA County, 4.5 million voters. This is complicated stuff. So it's going to be hard to make it safe for every single voter and poll worker if we just go ahead with the way we did it in 2016. It's going to be very, very tough.
Great. Hey, so Howard, one of our listeners is asking whether or not there would be constitutional issues if, in fact, some kind of sweeping federal measure passed requiring states to vote by mail, for instance. Would there be federalism challenges to that, and what's the likelihood of success?
Hey, Cornell, I just wanted to chime in. We got two of your undergrads as well have also asked similar questions about the balance of federal and state authority. So yeah, if I could just chime in a little bit on that.
Absolutely. Real quick, we tend to forget this because it's buried in our distant past. Our whole system of the way we elect people to Congress, for example, was created by a federal statute in 1824. That is, Article 1, Section 2 says Congress can determine the time, place, and manner of elections. Actually, it says states may determine those things, but Congress may override the states on those questions. And in the 1800s acts, and there have been numerous election acts over the years, the idea of single district winner-take-all congressional elections was created. Prior to that time, states experimented with a lot of different things, at-large elections, all sorts of different things. And the reason I mention that is because we take it so for granted that congressional elections take place on the basis of individual winner-take-all districts, that it's surprising to be reminded that's not in the Constitution. So the short answer is no, there really shouldn't be a plausible federalism issue here, because Congress's authority over questions other than voting qualifications are essentially plenary. That is, Congress has full authority to say every state has to have at-large elections or proportional elections or multiple candidate elections or whatever they want. I say other than because the one thing that is specifically reserved to the states is determining who is qualified to vote. And the only rule is states have to qualify people for federal elections who are qualified to vote in the state elections for the most populous, the largest house of the state legislature. It's only an equal treatment requirement. There's no substantive, that's what I meant when I said there's no requirement, right to vote secured by the Constitution. So in principle, states can restrict access to voting in federal elections very, very strictly, merely by doing the same thing in their own elections. And the only potential remedy would be political. But the federalism challenge to a national law of the type that we, national vote by mail systems or something like that, a federalism challenge to that seems very unlikely to win. There is an exception. I'm sorry, these things are always complicated. So there's what's called the anti-commandeering principle, which says that the federal government can't pass a law that requires state officials to carry out a federal mandate. It's a very modern creation of constitutional law. It's conceivable that if a federal universal vote by mail law were created, and as a requirement of that law, state officials were required in the process of administering the law to carry out the process of mailing ballots, collecting ballots, and so on, that could be challenged under this rather, to the public, obscure federalist notion of anti-commandeering. I should think it should still lose only because the Constitution specifically vests in Congress this Article 1, Section 2 power to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. But that would be the one place I could see a serious challenge.
Okay, I think we have time for just one quick question. One of our listeners asks, what about the prospect of mandatory voting, such as in Australia? What's the evidence of the impact of that? And I'll also add, is that likely that we'll see something like that in the United States anytime soon? I'll ask you, Todd, to start with that.
Oh, yeah, no, it's.
You spent a lot of time in Australia. Come on now.
Yeah, and I've done polling on it with people in Australia, and it remains popular across both major parties in Australia, and it's hugely unpopular in polls that we've seen in the United States. So I don't think that would be anything that'd be given much consideration.
What's the impact of on voter turnout?
In Australia, it's compulsory attendance at the polls. You don't have to vote. You can cast a ballot that's spoiled. It's near 95+% turnout. So I mean, it works, but it's just I hate to make cultural arguments, but people there have a different sense of civic duty that somehow includes that compulsory voting is good and okay. And I don't think we have that sense of civic duty here. I mean, we have a different sense of civic duty that you vote because it's a good thing to do. You vote because you're interested. You don't vote because somebody's forcing you to vote. But yeah, and it's not just Australia. There's other countries with compulsory voting, but yeah, they have very high turnout.
Right. So, Paul, I'm not sure you addressed this directly. What's the evidence on voter turnout with respect to vote by mail systems?
Yeah, Todd mentioned it briefly in his comments. I have a sort of standard line I use on this. The impact is small but statistically significant. It's a small positive. We know from a lot of work that actually most election reforms are like that. It's sort of a complement to some things that Howard, I think it would be fair to say, obliquely referred to. look, this is going to be a presidential election, an extremely competitive one. Every single switch and button and faucet is going to be on. And some of these alternatives are extremely important to provide full access and equitable access, and so people feel safe and don't have to make a difficult choice between being safe and going to the polls. But I don't expect much of this is going to be a high turnout election, no matter what. And that's just the reality. Where we're going to see the impact of any of these changes is actually after 2020 in state and local elections in 2021. If people say, hey, voting at home is great, I really love it, and they start to do it. But it's sort of interesting. I've been asked the question a lot, what's going to be the impact on turnout in November 2020? Boy, I think people are going to get to the polls however they can.
Okay. Oh, great. Well, this has been an excellent discussion. Unfortunately, our time's up. Let me thank all of our listeners for joining us today on YouTube. And let me thank our guests for a really lively and interesting conversation. Look for our next virtual event. We hope to have at least one more before the end of the semester. We'll see you. Everyone stay safe.